Canada is preparing for an energy war against its own neighbor and main partner, the United States. A country that shares the world's longest border with Canadians, almost 9,000 kilometers, and a similar culture, but which today has become its greatest threat. The trigger has a name: Donald Trump. His re-election to the White House in November 2024 not only broke the USMCA free trade agreement with an aggressive tariff policy, but also destroyed mutual trust. While some northern US states depend almost entirely on electricity imported from Canada, Trump himself has joked, or perhaps threatened, to annex Canada as if it were the 51st state.
Since becoming president, has constantly talked about wanting Canada to become the 51st state of the United States.
For Ottawa, the conclusion is clear. They can no longer trust Washington. And so, Prime Minister Mark Carney has launched an ambitious plan to turn Canada into a global energy superpower, capable of competing head-to-head with the United States.
The second thing we're doing is to invest across the entire energy supply chain to make Canada an energy superpower.
But what does energy have to do with the conflict with the US? Why is it so important for the country to take off in terms of energy in order to protect itself, or even corner Trump? We'll see in this video, but here's a preview. Canada is a real sleeping giant on the global energy map. It's the 4th largest oil reserve on the planet, the 2nd largest producer of hydroelectric power, and has enough natural gas to supply half the continent. And yet, 99% of its exports continue to go to the United States. This dependence makes the Canadian giant hostage to Trump's whims, but at the same time, it's the key to keeping him in check. Despite being a country overlooked by many, Canada is one of the most resource-rich places in the world. It is the country in the world with the 4th largest oil reserves, far surpassing other well-known producers such as the United Arab Emirates, Russia, and even the United States. In other words, they have plenty of dinosaur juice to spare. But Canadians can boast about more than just their crude oil reserves. They also rank 16th in the world in terms of natural gas reserves, and are the 2nd largest producer of hydroelectric power in the world, accounting for 10% of global production. In fact, Canada's energy mix, that is, the amount of each resource they use to supply themselves, is one of the most balanced in the world. As you can see, hydroelectric power accounts for almost 60% of Canada's energy mix. When compared to the United States or other OPEC countries, these two are much more dependent on non-renewable resources such as coal, gas, or oil. This is not only an advantage in terms of security, but also because, with so much clean energy available, natural gas and oil extraction is among the least polluting in the world, as these renewable energies are used to power the extraction plants. Canada can also boast some of the world's largest reserves of scarce materials. For example, it has the 5th largest gold reserves, the 3rd largest nickel reserves, and the largest potassium reserves. They also have huge reserves of uranium. In fact, they are the world's 2nd largest producer, and mines such as the Athabasca Basin produce uranium with about 100 times more radioactive material than the global average. Given all this, it is no surprise that Donald Trump wants to annex Canada, and many see access to all these resources as the real reason why the US president is trying to make Canada the 51st state. Now, if Canada has all these resources, why isn't it already an energy superpower? What steps could it take to become a globally significant country? Well, stay tuned because we're going to look at all its problems one by one. One of Canada's main problems, and the reason why it's so affected by the tariffs imposed by the United States, is precisely its high dependence on the US market. For example, Canada is the largest supplier of oil to the United States, supplying approximately 20% of the country's demand. In fact, the United States imports more oil from Canada than it does from all OPEC countries and the Persian Gulf combined, except for the period immediately following the COVID-19 pandemic when demand was at its lowest. Canada's exports to its neighbor have continued to increase, and currently 99% of exports go to the United States. As well as oil, Canadians also export huge amounts of natural gas to the Americans, approximately 9% of US demand. If we add to this the electricity they export, energy accounts for 22% of all trade between the two countries, far exceeding automobiles and metals. And this trade has not only been beneficial for Canada. Between its own production and imports from its northern partner, the United States has practically secured its energy independence without having to depend on countries such as Russia or Saudi Arabia. With all this in mind, you can understand that even though Trump's tariffs on energy imports are only 10%, it's still a considerable blow to the Canadian economy. Starting with the most obvious, he wants to diversify exports much more. This is the current situation of Canada's oil exports. Given that exports to countries other than the United States are marginal, the Canadian Prime Minister has decided to open up to new markets. For example, this year an oil tanker sailed from Canada's west coast to South Korea, marking the first export of liquefied natural gas by Canadians to a destination other than the United States.
Canada begins a new energy era with the export of its first shipment of LNG.
Taking advantage of the mess caused by Trump's tariffs, many European and Asian investors have seen a golden opportunity to invest in infrastructure so that Canada can export more and more efficiently to the rest of the world. And bear in mind that this doesn't mean more export revenue, it also translates into jobs. In the case of Asia, for instance, more than 50,000 Canadians have participated in contracts worth almost $6 billion awarded to local companies. What's more, the liquefied natural gas market is booming. In Asia alone, it's expected to grow by 60% by 2040, thanks to the fact that more and more countries want to burn less coal, and incidentally, depend a little less on the United States. But Canada is not just looking outward. It's also cleaning house. A few weeks ago, provincial leaders met with the Prime Minister and agreed on something historic: to eliminate internal trade barriers. Because, in case you didn't know, Canadians have tariffs between their own provinces. It's crazy. And in fact, it's one of the reasons for their lack of economic growth. This new internal trade will not only boost the domestic economy, it will also allow energy to flow from coast to coast. And that means more muscle to export to both Asia and Europe. And speaking of Europe, Canada could have a key partner here. Brussels is obsessed with reducing CO2 emissions, and it turns out that Canadians have an advantage. Because much of their electricity comes from renewables, they can extract natural resources more cleanly than other competitors. In other words, Europe could reward Canada with lower pollution taxes, giving it a price advantage over dirtier rivals. Even so, despite all these advantages, Canada continues to face one difficult obstacle: a lack of investment in infrastructure. Having natural resources galore is, in theory, a blessing for anyone aspiring to be a world power. But in Canada's case, there's one small but significant detail: its enormous size. Transporting materials, equipment, and personnel to the most remote areas of the north of the country is a logistical nightmare. It's expensive, slow, and in many cases, almost impossible. Imagine this: there are regions that are only accessible by plane, barge, or the famous ice roads. Ice roads built on frozen lakes and rivers that, obviously, only exist in winter, a challenge worthy of Game of Thrones. Now, the fact that resources are located in such inaccessible places would not be a problem if Canada had a modern and well-connected infrastructure network. The reality, quite the opposite. For decades, the country has neglected this issue, and the consequence has been clear. Exporting almost everything to the United States, which does have pipelines, ports, and routes ready to take those resources to Asia and Europe. The data speaks for itself. In the last 15 years, 20 liquefied natural gas projects have been proposed in Canada. Do you know how many have gone ahead? Only one. In Kitimat, British Columbia. And why so few? Because each project has to start from scratch. There are no oil pipelines, no gas pipelines, no existing infrastructure to reduce costs. And not surprisingly, building everything from scratch is much more expensive than simply expanding what already exists. The result is devastating. Canada is missing out on the opportunity to become a much more reliable exporter than the United States. In fact, at the end of last year, Canada's Enbridge cancelled a $7.9 billion project that would have connected Alberta to the northwest coast of British Columbia.
Enbridge cancels plans for natural gas pipeline in northern British Columbia.
Other companies, such as energy company TC Energy, have also been cancelling some projects due to the difficulty in financing them. The lack of infrastructure doesn't only refer to the lack of gas pipelines or the need to invest in new oil wells. It's estimated that something as simple as potholes on Canadian roads cause annual costs of more than $1.7 billion in repairs and lost productivity. So as you can see, it's not enough to be rich in natural resources. Canada needs to make a significant investment in developing and modernizing its transportation infrastructure if it really wants to compete with the major players in the energy sector. But there is something that could be even worse than this lack of investment: regulatory problems. Yes, Canada, like almost every developed country, is not immune to strict environmental regulations that have caused quite a few headaches for companies in the energy sector. Carney, despite being a staunch environmentalist, knows full well that these restrictive policies were one of the reasons why Trudeau's image ended up in tatters. That's why he has proposed relaxing all regulations and is trying to collaborate with oil and gas companies to quickly deregulate and make the activity profitable again. If you don't believe me, just look at one of Carney's first moves in March, when he became interim prime minister, replacing Trudeau even before the elections were held.
Carney kills consumer carbon tax in first move as prime minister.
As you can see, Carney, aware that this tax was extremely unpopular and was boosting his rival, the conservative Pierre Poilievre, decided to scrap the carbon tax. What's more, both the federal government and the provinces are trying by all means to reduce the time it takes to approve infrastructure projects, promoting public and private investment, and returning many of the decisions directly to the provincial governments so that they can approve projects much more quickly. For now, the Conservative opposition, led by Poilievre, welcomes the Prime Minister's reforms and is willing to support the reforms needed to move projects forward, but it remains to be seen whether they can secure the investment needed to carry them out. Even so, don't think that Carney has completely renounced all his environmental ideals and become the Canadian version of Donald Trump. The reality is that many environmental regulations, such as those on emissions, are still in force. Gas and oil companies will be required to cut their emissions by a third over the next 8 years, which means they'll have to spend much more money, and it will cost them much more to make these resources profitable. But even if Canada achieves Javier Milei level deregulation, there is still one more hurdle to overcome: opposition from Indigenous peoples and environmental groups. It may sound surreal to some of you, but the reality is that Canadian authorities are encountering a serious problem in the form of opposition from Indigenous groups. Under Canadian law, the government is required to consult these groups on any infrastructure project that passes through their lands. But what is even more surprising is that they're obliged to offer them a new location if they ultimately have to leave their settlements. And although the law does not give these groups veto power, it can cause significant delays to projects, and many of them have ended up being cancelled due to outright opposition from these groups. Fortunately for the Canadian government, there are also other Indigenous people who are willing to listen to and even promote the construction of new energy facilities. In fact, many of them do have an interest in seeing the projects go ahead, as the government offers them a share of the profits to distribute among their communities in return. Even so, as tough as the Indigenous people may be, there is one other group that is causing many headaches for the Canadian energy sector: environmental groups. As we've already mentioned, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was a radical environmentalist, so much so that he made headlines such as this one.
Canadian government overturns environmental policy. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau appointed a former Greenpeace activist, nicknamed Green Jesus, as Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
In his climate zeal, Trudeau gave a lot of prominence to environmental groups, so much so that he appointed a former Greenpeace activist as minister. This obviously did not sit well with oil and gas-rich provinces such as Alberta. Tensions were so high that these provinces even began to consider secessionist movements and propose leaving Canada if regulations were not relaxed. Even though Trudeau is no longer in office, all these groups remain very strong and influential in Canadian politics. So much so that if Carney is not careful, they could deal a severe blow in future elections. So as you can see, Canada has all the conditions, but also many challenges, if it were to become the energy superpower of the future. But what do you think? Will Canada overcome these obstacles and become the great energy dominator? Will it be able to surpass competitors such as the United States and the OPEC countries? Or will it be impossible and remain a country dependent on its American neighbor? You can leave me your responses down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week, so subscribe to the channel and click the little bell icon so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like the video, go ahead and like it, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. See you next time.